Learn English through stories, C30 PDF. Adopted and modified by Kulwant Singh Sandhu. Contents: 1. Anne of Green Gables. Chaps 6, 7 and 8. 2. 2. 3. Picture dictionary page. Anne of Green Gables. Chapter 6. Diana comes to tea. "Anne, I'm going out this afternoon," said Marilla one Saturday. "You can invite Diana here for tea. There's cake and a bottle of fruit cordial on a shelf in the kitchen closet." When Diana arrived, the two little girls played outside. "I'm very thirsty," said Diana after a time. "Would you like some fruit cordial?" asked Anne. She went to the kitchen closet and got the bottle. The cordial was a dark red color. Anne wasn't thirsty, but Diana drank a big glass of it. "This is very nice," she said. "Can I have another glass?" After 3 glasses of cordial, Diana put her hands to her head. "I'm not feeling very well," she said. "I have to go home." "But, Diana," cried Anne sadly, "don't you want any cake?" "No," said Diana. "I have to go home now." The next day, Sunday, it rained all day, and Anne stayed at home. On Monday, Marilla sent Anne to Mrs. Lynde's house. But Anne came back very quickly and ran into the kitchen. "Anne, what's wrong?" asked Marilla. "Why are you crying?" "Mrs. Barry was at Mrs. Lynde's house today," said Anne. "She said very bad things about me. When Diana left here on Saturday, she was drunk." "Drunk?" cried Marilla in surprise. "What did you give her?" "Only the fruit cordial," answered Anne unhappily. Marilla went to the kitchen closet and found the bottle of cordial. She looked at it. It wasn't fruit cordial. It was red wine. "Oh, no," she thought. "I remember now, the fruit cordial is in the other closet." Marilla went to see Mrs. Barry. She tried to tell Mrs. Barry about the mistake, but Mrs. Barry didn't want to listen. "That Anne Shirley is a very bad little girl," she said. "I don't want Diana to play with her again." Anne was very sad. She loved Diana very much. Some days later, she went back to school. "I can't be Diana's friend now," Anne told Marilla, "but I can look at her in school." Anne worked hard. The other girls liked her, and she had a lot of friends. But she was very unhappy about Diana. One evening some weeks later, Marilla went to a meeting in Charlottetown, the most important town on Prince Edward Island. Mrs. Lynde and Diana's parents went to the meeting too. They all slept in Charlottetown that night. Anne and Matthew stayed at home. They sat in the kitchen and studied her lessons at the table. Suddenly, Diana ran through the door. Her face was very white. "Oh, Anne, please come quickly," she said. "Minnie May is very sick. She has croup. Maybe she's going to die." Matthew got up quietly and put on his coat. "I'll go for the doctor," he said, and went out. "Don't be afraid, Diana," said Anne. "I know about croup. Mrs. Hammond had 8 children, and they all had it. Wait, Marilla has some medicine. I'll bring it with me." And went with Diana to the Barrys' house. The ground was white with snow. When they arrived at the house, Anne went to Minnie May. She was very sick. "Now, Diana, bring me hot water," said Anne. She undressed Minnie May and put her to bed. Then she gave her some medicine. All night Minnie May was very sick, but in the early morning she slept quietly. Matthew arrived with the doctor. "I'm sorry we're late," he said. "The doctor wasn't at home. I had to wait for a long time." The doctor looked at Minnie May. You did very well, Anne, he said, and drove home with Matthew in the snow. When they arrived at Green Gables and went to bed that afternoon, Marilla was downstairs in the kitchen. "How was the meeting, Marilla?" asked Anne. "Fine," answered Marilla. "Listen, Anne, Mrs. Barry was here this morning and told me about Minnie May's croup. She wanted to say thank you to you, and she's very sorry about the fruit cordial. She wants you and Diana to be friends again." "Oh, Marilla, that's wonderful," cried Anne. "Can I go and see Diana now?" "Yes," said Marilla, and smiled, and ran quickly to Diana's house. It was cold, and she had no coat or hat, but she was the happiest girl in Avonlea. Suddenly, Diana ran through the door. Chapter 7. A Cake for Mrs. Allen. The long summer vacation began at the end of June. Mr. Phillips left the Avonlea school. The old minister left the church too, and a new minister came. His name was Mr. Allen. He brought his pretty young wife with him. "I'll ask Mr. and Mrs. Allen to tea on Wednesday," said Marilla. "Oh, Marilla," said Anne excitedly. "Can I make a cake?" "All right, Anne," said Marilla. On Wednesday morning, Anne got up early and made her cake. It looked very good. In the afternoon, Anne put flowers around the table. Then Mr. and Mrs. Allen arrived. "The table looks beautiful," they said. Anne felt very happy. She sat at the table with Matthew and Marilla. Matthew wore his best clothes. "Would you like some cake, Mrs. Allen?" asked Anne. "I made it for you." "Yes, please," said Mrs. Allen, and she smiled. And cut some cake for Mrs. Allen. Mrs. Allen put the cake in her mouth and started to eat it, but she didn't look very happy. "Is something wrong?" thought Marilla. She tried some cake, too. "And Shirley," she cried, "what did you put in this?" Only vanilla," answered Anne. She went to the kitchen and brought back a small bottle. On the front of the bottle, it said, "Best vanilla." Marilla opened the bottle. "This isn't vanilla," she said. "It's medicine. Last week I broke the medicine bottle. I put the medicine into this old vanilla bottle." "Medicine," said Anne. "Oh." She ran upstairs to her room. She cried and cried. A little later, Anne heard somebody on the stairs, but she didn't look up. "Oh, Marilla," she said, "I'm very unhappy. Everybody in Avonlea will hear about my cake. They'll laugh at me. I can't go downstairs. I can't look at Mrs. Allen again. I'm very sorry, Marilla. Please tell Mrs. Allen." "You tell her, Anne," said Mrs. Allen. Anne looked up. "Mrs. Allen?" she said in surprise. "Yes, it's me," said Mrs. Allen and laughed. "Don't cry, Anne. The medicine in the cake was a very funny mistake." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Allen," said Anne. "I wanted to make a nice cake for you." "I know," said Mrs. Allen. "And now please come down and show me your flowers. I'm very interested in flowers." Anne felt happy again. She went downstairs with Mrs. Allen and nobody said anything about the cake. A week later, Anne ran into the kitchen at Green Gables. She was very excited. She had a letter in her hand. "Mrs. Allen is inviting me to tea tomorrow afternoon," she said. "Look at this letter, Marilla. It says, Miss and Shirley Green Gables. Nobody called me Miss before." The next afternoon, Anne went to tea with Mrs. Allen. "I had a wonderful time with Mrs. Allen," she told Marilla later. "She's very kind. And she wore a beautiful dress. We talked for a long time. I told her about Mrs. Thomas and Mrs. Hammond and the orphanage. I told her about Green Gables and the school too. Mrs. Allen told me something interesting. A new teacher is coming to Avonlea after the vacation. Her name is Miss Muriel Stacy. Isn't that a pretty name? I want to meet her very much. Chapter 8. An Accident and a New Dress. Some weeks later, Diana had a party. She invited Anne and the other girls in her class. They had a very good time. After tea, the girls played outside. "Let's play a new game," said one of the girls. "Let's do exciting things. Who can climb the big tree by Diana's front door?" One of the girls climbed the tree, then another girl thought of something more exciting. "Who can climb up to the top of Diana's house?" she said. "I can," cried Anne. She ran to the house. "Stop, Anne," called Diana. "That's very dangerous," and started to climb to the top of the house, but it was very difficult. Suddenly she fell to the ground. Diana ran to her. "Oh, Anne, Anne, are you dead?" she said. Anne opened her eyes. Her face was very white. "No, I'm not dead, Diana," she said. "But my leg hurts, I can't walk." Mr. Barry carried Anne home to Green Gables. When Marilla saw Mr. Barry with Anne in his arms, she felt very afraid. Was Anne dead? "I love Anne very much," she thought. "I know that now." She ran to Mr. Barry. "What happened?" she asked. "Don't be afraid, Marilla," said Anne. "I fell off Diana's house." Anne couldn't go back to school. She stayed home for 7 weeks. Her friends came to see her every day. They brought her flowers and books. She had many other visitors, too. Mrs. Allen and Mrs. Lynde came often. When Anne's leg was better, she went back to school. She liked Miss Stacy very much. Miss Stacy was a very good young teacher, and Anne worked hard in her lessons. "Stop, Anne," called Diana. "I love Miss Stacy," Anne said to Marilla and Matthew one evening. "She wants us to give a concert at Christmas. Isn't that exciting? Diana's going to sing a song, and I'm going to say 2 poems." One evening, Matthew went into the kitchen at Green Gables. Anne's friends were there. They laughed and talked about the concert. They were very excited. Matthew watched them. "Anne looks different from the other girls, but why?" he thought. He thought all evening, then suddenly he knew the answer. "Anne's clothes are different," he thought. "The other girls wear pretty dresses. Marilla makes good dresses for Anne, but they aren't very pretty." Then Matthew had an idea. "I'm going to give Anne a new dress for Christmas," he thought. He went to the store in town and tried to buy a dress. But he couldn't because he didn't know much about girls' dresses. "Maybe somebody can make a pretty dress for Anne," he thought. "But who? I don't know many women in Avonlea. I can't ask Marilla, I know. I'll have to ask Mrs. Lynde." He went to see Mrs. Lynde. "Of course I'll help you, Matthew," said Mrs. Lynde. "And I won't tell Marilla. It'll be a surprise." On Christmas morning, Anne woke up early. She looked out of the window and felt very happy. The trees were white with snow. She ran downstairs into the kitchen, and Matthew gave her the dress, and started to cry. "What's wrong?" said Matthew. "Don't you like it?" "Oh yes, Matthew," answered Anne. "I love the dress, it's beautiful, thank you. I'm crying because I'm very happy." That night, Anne wore her new dress to the concert. She said her 2 poems very well. Matthew and Marilla were at the concert too. Later, they sat by the kitchen fire and talked. "Anne did very well tonight," said Matthew. "Yes," said Marilla. "She's very smart, and she looked very nice in her new dress." She's 13 now, said Matthew. One day she'll leave the Avonlea school. We have to think about her future. 2. Ought to. You use ought to make strong suggestions and talk about someone's duty. 1. You look tired. You ought to go to bed early tonight. 2. I ought to get more physical exercise. 3. We ought to lock the door when we leave home. 4. You ought to turn off the computer when you're not using it. 5. You ought to know how to spell your own name. 6. The teacher ought to make his classes more interesting. 7. I ought to relax and stop worrying about it. 8. He ought to resign, I think. 9. We ought to inform head office. 10. You really ought to quit smoking. 11. They ought to have apologized. 12. We ought not to be quarreling now. 13. We ought not to shut our eyes to these facts. 14. She really ought to find new friends. Advice. 1. You ought to stay here till the storm ends. 2. You had better stay here till the storm ends. Suggestion. 1. You should try harder. 2. You ought to try harder. Duty. 1. Children should follow the school's safety regulations. 2. Children ought to follow the school's safety regulations. 3. Picture dictionary page.